individuals, and also we have the close interrelationship between the economic and the political sphere. On the other hand, we have neoclassical economics, which is the study of the economy in abstraction from social and political relations as a plea between individuals. There cannot be social groups as each individual is different from the other. However, these totally different individuals obey miraculously the same behavioral norm. That means minimize cost while maximize utility. So on the other hand, we have neoclassical economics where the main focal point is not the society as a whole, neither the social classes is the primary unit of analysis, but the primary unit of analysis, meaning that this is the point of reference, is the atomic individual who is rational, is perfect rational, and she or she is going to maximize his or her utility. So let's now move and let's attempt to define the political economy. So political economy, what is in a word? So is the political economy just a theoretical strand, a methodological strand, or a school of thought which we can define in terms of intersection of economics and politics? No, this is actually a very naive and ahistorical perception. On the other hand, the question of what constitutes classical political economy has been highly controversial in the history of economic thought. We have in the history of economic thought, three most famous statements on this are those of Marx, Keynes, and Schumpeter, and they are widely divergent. So we have actually three different definitions of what constitutes the political economy. So for Marx, classical political economy starts, of course, in England after the Industrial Revolution with the work of the mercantilist William Petit and ends with its greatest representative, as Marx called him, David Ricardo. On the other hand, Keynes includes in his definition all the writers who did not reject Say's law, from Ricardo to his contemporary Pigou. Last but not least, Schumpeter named the so-called the classic period of economics, spanned from the period from 1898 to 1871, and included those as diverse as Malthus and Jevons. So we have three divergent definitions of political economy. So the question here is actually what constitutes political economy? Let's move on to the next. So today, in contemporary economic science, by the term political economy, we mean two things. We mean classical political economy plus Marxian political economy. Classical political economy, which is the first part of the so-called political economy, includes classical economists like Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Mill. As Mill wrote, that political economy, that school of thought, this theoretical trend, inform us of the laws which regulate the production, distribution, and consumption of wealth. On the other hand, the second part, the second constitute of the political economy, which is the Marxian political economy, actually stems from the classics of Marxist political economy, which are Marx and Engels. Again, for Marx, the real nature of the political economy is to reveal the economic law of motion of modern society. So, all these writers, including the classical economists and also Marx and Engels, were interested in questions of long-term economic development and focused their attention on the evolution of the economic system as a whole at the level of economic aggregates. Primacy is given here to the social and collective whole rather than the individual actor. And the economic system as a whole is the object of investigation, while classes form the basic units of analysis and not the individual, as we are going to see to be the case in the neoclassical economic theory. Now, let's move on to try to attempt to define, to provide a robust definition of the neoclassical economics. Starting from 1890s, there was a rupture, a methodological and epistemological rupture in economic science, primarily in the movement from the tradition of political economy to neoclassical economics via the marginalist revolution, and it is both methodological and substantive in content. Since the end of the 19th century, neoclassical economics have begun the dominant approach. Thus, it constitutes the orthodoxy or the mainstream. Until today, in all the universities in economic, all over the world, in economic departments, the main school of thought is the neoclassical economics. So, political economy continues its existence mainly in the form of Marxist and radical political economy, but it is relegated to the, let's say, underworld, excluded from the commanded heads of economic policy making. As Schumpeter puts it, the concept of marginal utility, which is the primacy point of reference in the neoclassical theory. So the concept of marginal utility was the new ferment which has changed the inner structure of modern theory into something quite different from that of the classical economists. Hence, the change from political economy to economics symbolically reflected in the title of the classic magnus opus of the new neoclassical economics, Principles of Economics, authored by Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall, professor of political economy in the University of Cambridge, was the founder of the neoclassical economics. So here you can see a table with the main analytical and methodological differences between the political economy, as we have said, is political economy equals to classical political economy plus Marxian political economy, and neoclassical economics. So, from political economy, the agent is the social classes. So we have inherent contradiction between social classes. For instance, in the Marxian political economy, the fundamental contradiction is the class relations, the antagonistic class relations between capitalists and workers. On the other hand, in the neoclassical economics, the primary unit of analysis is the atomic individual. So, while in the political economy, in the level of agent, the economy is a social game, in the level of a social whole, in neoclassical economics, since the primary unit of the analysis is the individual, the economy considered to be a game between individuals, just between individuals. In the political economy, the primary focus, as we have said earlier, is the production, is the sphere of production. You need first to analyze, to study the production relations, and then move on to another level of study and to analyze the market relations, the so-called demand and supply. Okay, because in order to have market, in order to have production exchanges, you need first to have production of these goods. On the other hand, in the neoclassical economics, the primary focus is the circulation and only that involved in market exchange, the so-called market relations. In political economy, we have a dual system: labor, values, the notion of value, and then you have the prices. In the political economy, the notion of value is not identically with the notion of price. We have different levels of analysis. In the first level, we have the determination of value, and then in a second level of analysis, you have the determination of price. On the other hand, in the neoclassical economics, you have a single system in the sense that in neoclassical economics, value is actually, the notion of value is actually identical with the notion of price. In the political economy, the analysis of the economy in relation to society and politics is considered to be analyzed in a wholly unified framework. On the other hand, in neoclassical economics, you have a separately study of the sphere of economic sphere and the political sphere. Actually, the neoclassical economics said that it is the study, the relation of economics to politics, is actually has been the study of political science. So here you can see that, as we have said earlier, political economy is the classical political economy plus the Marxist political economy. On the other hand, you have neoclassical economics, which if we need to construct a more wider concept, we can say that on one hand we have political economics, and on the other hand we have economics. By economics we mean two main schools of thought: neoclassical economics plus Keynesianism. But for the purpose at hand, for this lecture, we focus on neoclassical economics. So, for political economy, you have the main fundamental theory, which is the labor theory of value, LTV, and the class analysis. On the other hand, in neoclassical economics, you have the theory of three production factors, and you have also utility theory. Let me explain in a nutshell. In neoclassical economics, neoclassical economists teach that in economic sphere you have three production factors: labor, capital, land. On the other hand, in the political economy, you have only one production factor, and this is labor. Only labor produces value. Then, in the neoclassical economics, you have the utility theory. The primary unit of analysis is the individual who strives to maximize his or her utility. On the other hand, in the political economy, the methodological starting point is not the individual, but is classes: capitalist class, worker class, and so on. So, value. In the political economy, as we have seen, you have the labor theory of value. Labor theory of value is an objective theory of value. Means that the value of any product is determined by the historically, socially determined hours of work that it needs in order to have the production of this good. On the other hand, we have in the neoclassical economics utility theory. This is a subjective theory of value. Then we have the notion of value. In the neoclassical economics, we have the notion of value is the intersection between the two forces, the two market forces, which are the demand and supply. So you have a static notion of equilibrium. On the other hand, in the political economy, the notion of equilibrium is different in the sense that it means a dynamic production and reproduction of the status quo of the economic system, which is, of course, the capitalism. The notion of price. In neoclassical economics, you have the price, which is determined by, again, the intersection between supply and demand. On the other hand, you have the notion of relative prices, which reflect the socially necessary labor time. In terms of methodology, again, in political economy, you have social structures, which are determined structurally in the sphere of production. So you have workers who did not have the means of production, and on the other hand, you have capitalists who are the owners of the means of production. And on the other hand, in the neoclassical economics, you have individuals, merely atomic individuals. At best, groups only form of the basis of rent-seeking behavior. So you have two different epistemological approaches. In the political economy, you have the methodological holism, and on the other hand, in the neoclassical economics, you have the methodological individualism. In terms now of economic policy, in political economy, any policy is analyzed in terms of class analysis. That means that any economic policy has specific class-based, has a class-based intersection between the two main classes of capitalism. On the other hand, in the neoclassical economics, you have commonality of interest, means that there are no structural interests at existence in the economic system. Be careful here, we use the term structural interest and not just merely interests. Now, and for the conclusion, let's see how these two different methodological, epistemological, and analytical approaches in the economic science reflect different understandings of the subjective economic reality. And let's see the example of the euro. Starting from the neoclassical theory, neoclassical theory explains euro in terms exclusively of economic efficiency. Neoclassical economists said that the euro is the product of, let's say in another way, that euro as a currency, as a mechanism, minimize transaction cost. That leads to an economic efficiency. Also, the euro is a strong currency. Also, the euro promotes the growth of intra-European trade. And in this context of analysis, the starting point is that there is a commonality of interest, no class analysis. So you have the Eurozone, you have individuals, not capitalists, not workers, but just individuals, and the euro promotes economic efficiency because of these reasons: transaction cost minimization, it is a strong currency, and promotes the growth of intra-European trade. On the other hand, in the trend of political economy, you have the consideration that euro is explained mainly in terms of class analysis. Means that the euro was a product of European capitalist class, and mainly German capitalist class, versus American capitalist class, in order to compete the European capitalist class, the American capitalist class, in terms of global currency. That means that the European capitalist class in some time need to compete the dollar in order to institutionalize competitive global currency, which is the euro. Second, euro is a mechanism that institutionalizes the internal devaluation policy. That means internal devaluation policy leads us to the third point, leads to the implementation of austerity policies, which is, of course, definitely a class policy. And the last point is that euro is not just a currency that, contrary to what neoclassical economy said, that it is a strong currency that minimizes transaction costs. It's not just a currency, but actually is an economic and social mechanism that aims to promote working class discipline. So that's all for me for now. Thank you very much for watching this. Bye for me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Haralabos Chrysomalidis. I'm a lecturer at the University in Neapolis of Pafos, and my first presentation for today has the title European Integration in Greek Economy, a rather complex correlation. The main points of my presentation is that on the one hand, we have the Greek economy and the fact that more than a decade has passed since the outbreak of the finance or fiscal crisis in Greece. And at the time, the Greek economy was stabilized as it seemed to have overcome severe crisis conditions. COVID-19 pandemic created a new socioeconomic context. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind the fact that economic prospects in Europe are related up to a point to next steps in European integration. And this has specifically to do with the transformation of monetary union to a real economic and monetary union. Some introduction at first. Greece has been one of EU's peripheral member states or cohesion countries, receiving considerable funding from the structural funds, and its productive pattern has been transformed in the last 40 years, losing gradually its productive capacity. High GDP growth rates, on the contrary, however, high GDP growth rates in the late 1990s and early 2000, the decade of 2000, were directly related to increased demand and consumption and proved to be not sustainable. Greece faced the most intense and severe recession conditions in the last decade due to fiscal crisis, and Greek economy is one of EU economies hit most in terms of GDP change by lockdowns due to COVID-19 pandemic. Our theoretical background relies mainly on the classical approach of economic integration, and according to a rather static analysis, synthesis of many individual national economies leads to the establishment of a single larger market that proves to be more competitive and more efficient. However, competition makes weaker economic actors leave market, thus big enterprises are favored expanding their existing activities, and therefore it is expected that economies that will benefit most from the creation of an integrated larger market will be those having the largest and most competitive companies. This means that the country may face also negative effects as a result of its membership in economic union, and it's very important to highlight here the fact that the integration theory, according to economic integration theory, since some of the countries that participate in common market may have to deal with higher losses than benefits, transfer of resources and payments from countries that derive benefits to those that face the main losses is justified. So, does economic integration fit all countries and all possible combinations of collaboration? The answer is definitely no. In the case, let's come to examine more specifically the case of the Eurozone. Optimistic ex-ante analysis predicted that the cost of abandoning national currencies would be relatively low. Any cost for participation in EU's monetary union could be offset by the benefits that would result finally from it. However, the opposite argument was that expressed by several scholars and economists who expressed their doubts about the potential success of monetary union in EU based on the optimum currency area approach and the so-called Mandel's argument. According to it, heterogeneity of national productive structures among EU member states, low price and wage flexibility, and modest labor mobility hinder success of monetary union in the case of EU member states. This position, which was documented even before launching the common currency, reached the conclusion that some countries that would participate in EMU may suffer a loss of prosperity per se, and these countries would mainly be those called as peripheral ones. In response to this analysis, and according to the viewpoint that prevailed at last, the operation of monetary union by itself would reduce or curb structural differences observed initially among member states, leading gradually to real convergence in terms of productivity and growth rates in all Eurozone countries. However, what about economic integration in the case of crisis? It would be accepted on general, on the whole, it would be expected that less competitive economies of an economic union would be at a disadvantage, and adjustment cost will depend on effectiveness of any correction mechanisms if they are there. If they do not exist, as in the case of the Eurozone, the demand hit state will be forced to reduce domestic circulation of money, mainly by reducing wages, provoking eventually economic recession. Let's see now the way that peripheral countries activated in the Eurozone after the circulation of common currency. In good days, converging money costs among Eurozone member states was translated into low interest rates. However, this has led to loss of fiscal discipline and higher consumption, mainly in peripheral and less competitive economies, leaving aside the need for structural reforms. The Greek case is a typical example of that. In Greece, productive potential is rather weak as domestic production of materials and intangible capital goods is limited, relying to imports, especially for capital goods. These conditions were combined with expansion of consumer demand in the decade of 2000, both from public and private sector, thanks to increased borrowing, and figure 1 is very indicative of that. These two diagrams, these two figures, show us loans to enterprises and households in Greece and the way that these were evolved from the 1980s until the early decade of 2010. As a matter of fact, countries at the periphery of the Eurozone experienced booms in construction spending. This is the case of Ireland and Spain. Consumption spending, mainly in Portugal, and government spending, as showed in the case of Greece, as the cost of borrowing for households, firms, and governments was lower. Thus, Eurozone peripheral countries have not taken advantage during the first years of Euro circulation of the possibilities of sound and stable macroeconomic environment, being trapped in financial crisis of greater or lesser intensity. At the same time, we have to keep in mind the fact that core countries of the Eurozone were taking steps to boost further their competitiveness. The consequence of this opposite practice was the development of centrifugal dynamic amongst the Eurozone member states in the wake of the financial crisis. Under these circumstances, one should bear in mind a structural characteristics of EMU, the role of the European Central Bank, which is not able to meet simultaneously all conflicting needs arising from different Eurozone member states. And when we refer to conflicting needs of different Eurozone member states, we have in mind, we refer actually to central Eurozone member states, which is the case of Germany, the case of Greece, the case of Italy, etc., and the peripheral member states, EU member states, which are the cohesion states. After the outburst of financial crisis, there were simultaneously two disturbing situations. Economic turbulence due to global financial crisis and structural productive and economic weaknesses of South European countries was combined with a locked exchange rate and price inflexibility for domestic products. This has led further to serious loss of competitiveness and exports decrease. Thus, most vulnerable Eurozone countries had to face high deficits in trade balance. Internal devaluation was chosen as the main adjustment instrument for all countries that agreed for a bailout program with their lenders. This is the Troika, mainly the International Monetary Fund, European Commission. Although this could be regarded initially as rational in economic terms, it has contributed to a situation where economy was trapped to deeper recession, making adjustment difficult for member states with fiscal problems. And this is exactly the result of the inexistence of an adjustment mechanism that would operate in Eurozone right from the beginning to face the challenges of a fiscal and economic crisis. Let's come now to the impact of crisis in Greece. Our first reference will be based on the explanatory positions of the International Monetary Fund that were produced after the outbreak of financial crisis in Greece. before the agreement for the first bailout program. The IMF confirms the peripherality hypothesis for Greek economy, and it argues that economy is relatively closed and its competitiveness has declined seriously since its accession to the EMU, in parallel to an already worrying high current account deficit. IMF's analysis refers also to ineffectiveness of national fiscal policy, as there has been a significant increase in spending and fiscal deficits just because the outbreak of crisis. And one can show here very clearly the fact that public revenues were lower than expenditure increase right from the beginning, from 2000 until the outburst of the crisis. And we have a very large difference between revenues and expenditure, specifically in 2008 and 2009 and 10. And this has resulted to a huge deficit of general government increase as percentage of GDP, which reached in 2009 15% of GDP, as you can see in figure 3. According to mainstream economics, under these circumstances, it is necessary to reduce money circulation in the economy via internal devaluation. However, the IMF itself had predicted the negative consequences of this policy for Greek economy, and it expected that there would be a deflationary scenario according to which GDP would decline for several years, domestic expenditure and tax revenues too would decrease, affecting negatively the debt to GDP ratio. Therefore, fiscal adjustment, according to IMF, fiscal adjustment should be realistic and relatively mild. Otherwise, domestic demand was expected to shrink sharply, deepening further recession. IMF's analysis predicted that debt to GDP ratio would reach 150% of GDP by 2013, while deficit would be lower than 3% after 2014. However, as we can see in the next figure, reality seemed to be even worse. This figure shows us the general government debt ratio increase as percentage of GDP. You can see here that until 2007, about the GDP, the debt ratio to GDP increase were about 100%. This was the same as much was the GDP. This was the height of Greece's debt. After 2008, we have an expansion of it to 126%, reaching its highest price in 2014, 2015, approximately 180% of GDP. Today, things are even worse as the debt to GDP ratio reaches 200% of GDP. IMF referred also to the Greek banking system and difficulties and challenges that it would face as the outflow of deposits had already begun. The IMF expected that the economy would face recession in 2010 and 2011, when then the economy would return to limited growth. Nominal GDP would be expected to reach the pre-crisis levels until 2014, which proved also to be not an accurate estimation when comparing it to real data. You can see them right here. You can see how the development of GDP in Greece, taking as a basis the GDP of 2005 in chain-linked volumes, you can see that after 2010, GDP was 80% of the GDP of Greece's GDP in 2005, which means that approximately during crisis, GDP in Greece was as much as high as GDP 20 and 25 years earlier. On the other hand, the way that Greek governments dealt with Greek crisis was not effective, as they had proposed cutting off spending without a more elaborated national strategy and plan to face crisis. And at the end of the day, Greek authorities followed the scenario of abrupt adoption that leads the economy to a severe shock. And here you can see also GDP growth in Greece as percentage of GDP, you can see a huge recession, a very intense recession after 2008, which reached 7% in 2011, 2012, 2013, and we had recession conditions in Greece until 2016. Greek governments were also responsible for delays in implementing fiscal and structural reforms, while debt restructuring, proposed initially by IMF in order to make the adjustment milder, has never been seriously considered by the Greek state. Why was that? Due to pressures of other EU partners whose banks were exposed to Greek bonds. In practice, government failures and cut research and finance needs made the final program and its conditions hard, difficult, and painful, as it was described by the IMF. This is the bailout program. Recession trap in the Greek case may be attributed to the following sequence. Wage cuts and high taxation led to lower demand and consumption and to reduction in savings, affecting negatively investment in production and high uncertainty, which contributes to cash holding. All this happens rationally for each economic individual, according to economic theory, but the ultimate outcome can be described as a gathering of self-acting rationalists whose decisions and actions lead to severe collapse of total demand, deepening further crisis. Finally, economy seems to be stabilized after 2016, approximately at the levels of the late 1990s, as I have already said. Despite slight increase of GDP after 2016, there seems to be still an investment gap. It is interesting here to compare the Greek cases with other Eurozone member states. In other EU countries, such as Ireland, Cyprus, Portugal, Spain, Latvia, and Hungary, which suffered also severely from consequences of the 2008 financial crisis, all returned to growth, however, although they faced difficulties, for instance, in terms of national income distribution and inequality. And we have to keep in mind here the fact that social adaptation has been violent, especially in Ireland and Cyprus. Even in these cases, GDP has already surpassed the pre-crisis level, but on the contrary, Greece needed more than 7 years to stabilize its economy at around about 80% of its pre-crisis GDP. And from this aspect, Greek crisis was the most intense and lasting, having the most serious negative impact on the economy. As you can see here, this very interesting figure from OECD, which shows GDP, the real GDP, development of the evolution of real GDP since 2000 until 2015, which is the black line, and compare it with the unemployment rate evolution in Greece, which is the gray line. You can see here this scissor, this X figure that it is being saved. And you can see this presents very clearly the intense of recession of Greek economy. Now let's come to the second part of my presentation, which deals with the next steps in European integration as a defining parameter for Greek economy's prospects in the future. And when we refer to Greek economy, we have to keep in mind that this refers also to other peripheral Eurozone member states too. What are the prospects for Greek economy beyond the COVID-19 conditions? Although there have been several proposals for exit crisis and recession, proposals for identifying, for example, priorities and preparing a national strategy to restrict production, conditions remain rather negative. Lockdowns due to the COVID-19 pandemic made things even worse. The Greek economy has diverged from the EU average during crisis, while international competitiveness of the country has not been improved despite internal devaluation and austerity measures. In any case, adopting a national currency would have major negative consequences for society and economy due to the definitely severe devaluation of the new currency if it would be under circulation, and that would contribute only slightly to improvement of domestic products competitiveness, deteriorating dramatically living standards of Greek society. However, as long as EMU structure remains the same, a new negative economic juncture will be probably lead to new asymmetric shocks that will affect peripheral Eurozone economies. Thus, there is a need for monetary union's evolution, integrating some features of fiscal union. There have been several proposals for that, as, for example, replicate the mechanism met in federal systems, providing income distribution among different regions. This is the case of Germany and the system of Finanzausgleich. The establishment of a kind European budgetary authority, the unification of bond market for all Eurozone member states, the elimination of competition among countries on the basis of tax differentiation, favoring a tax union and tax harmonization among member states, introduction of a mechanism to secure implementation of symmetrical fiscal policies among its member states, or a continuing process of integration that would lead probably to a political union by attributing key national competencies to supranational level. These options, all these options seem hard to be decided and implemented. However, in practice, the banking union proposal that was presented by the European Commission seems more realistic, as well as the prospect of turning the ESM to a European Monetary Fund may also be considered as a first firefighting initiative to avoid the extent of similar crises in the future. In general, a very interesting motto is that the more a preventive approach can be reinforced, the less resources needed to Euro-level emergency measures, and the greater will be the confidence that such measures can be introduced without risking moral hazard, which is very significant, very important in the case of Eurozone member states and the conflict between the rich, the North Eurozone member states, vis-a-vis the poorer, the Eurozone member states of South. However, the need for transforming monetary union into a real EMU is still here. And at the end of the day, an EMU with a new architecture would give the ability to face more efficiently any future economic asymmetric turbulence. In this context, pandemic showed up, and it was very interesting that this can be shown as a facilitator. It proved to be actually a facilitator for major EU and Eurozone decisions. The first very significant decision was the activation of the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact. This means that the limits, the limitations for the Stability and Growth Pact referring to government deficit and debt to GDP ratio are stopped. Other very interesting measures are having mainly funding characteristic, EU recovery funds as the next generation EU was introduced, the establishment of a funding instrument to provide temporary support to mitigate unemployment risk in emergency, the SURE program was also introduced, as well as the recovery and resilience facility, as well as the redirection of EU funds within the multi-annual financial framework. Let's come now to some concluding remarks of this whole situation about the correlation between the operation and the architecture and mechanisms of the Eurozone on the one hand, and the evolution of economies and economic prospects of peripheral Eurozone member states on the other. On the whole, one can say that Greece's participation in the Eurozone has not contributed to economic competitiveness. Greece did not manage to take advantage of chances and sound conditions that the Eurozone provided, as instead of exploiting momentum for higher investment, productivity and export performance, lower borrowing rates have led to an expansion of consumption through loans. And as I showed you earlier, this was translated both in private and public terms, and crisis in Greece affected structurally, very severely, national economy and its productive capacity. Beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, we can say that prospects for Greek economy in the future are doubtful, despite a slight return to growth since 2017. And the main problem is that Greece has not achieved higher growth rates after so many years of recession. Many economists argued that after about 8 to 9 years of severe recession, then there was a return to high growth rates, because the potential, the dynamic of economy would make that possible. However, and unfortunately, these arguments proved to be wrong in empirical terms. The fact that the country is obliged to achieve constantly high fiscal surpluses in the long run, according to the agreement between Greece and its lender, is also a problematic parameter for prospects of Greek economy. If we take as stated that adoption of a national currency is not a realistic option, and if we take that as granted, thus transforming Eurozone into a real EMU will make participation in the Eurozone sustainable and more advantageous for peripheral Eurozone countries. A potential agreement for the future of Eurozone faces the challenge of choosing between economically prudent and appropriate solutions on the one hand and politically acceptable solutions on the other. Pandemic created a new context for Eurozone's operation, and the main challenge is now to build a coherent EMU operation mechanism that would eliminate the need of taking ad hoc decisions by the Eurozone to face emergency conditions. Which would prove to be crucial to achieve a sound and stable environment for EU's EMU. The main point is that EMU should be structured in a way that it doesn't need to follow consequences, doesn't need to follow the evolutions after a crisis has emerged. It has to build its own adjustment mechanisms to make solutions operate in a quicker and more efficient way. And this is very clear as a need in the case of EU peripheral Eurozone member states. And this is very crucial because Eurozone at last still combines two very different kinds of economies. On the one hand, there are the developed Eurozone member states of Central and North Europe, which are very robust in productive structure and are competitive in the international market. And on the other hand, and have sound macroeconomic conditions, and on the other hand, simultaneously participate in the same operation, the same mechanism, participate Eurozone member states that have completely different characteristics. This means weak structural performance, low competitiveness in international market, and very bad fiscal condition and image. Therefore, the need to transform monetary union as it operates, as it stands now in the case of European Union, is necessary to transform it to a real economic and monetary union, to add the letter E to MU and make it EMU for real. Thank you for your attention. Hello again. We can go further to the next presentation that I have prepared for this summer school. Please allow to introduce myself again. I'm Haralambos Chrysomalidis, lecturer of Neapolis University Pafos, and this second presentation has the title Knowledge-Based EU Policies and Effect on the Greek Research and Innovation System. The main points of my second presentation is to refer to the context, to present the context of modern EU research, technology, innovation policy, let's say that RTI, Research, Technology and Innovation, international bodies like the OECD and the World Bank, as well as particular countries have laid emphasis on research, technology and innovation in order to achieve better economic performance and growth since the 1990s. The result of this evolution was the upgrade of this sector in national and supranational political agenda. Either we refer to European Union or the OECD, or we refer to the cases of, especially of Central and North European countries. Analysis in this session focuses on the effect that EU research and technology policy has on the Greek research and innovation system, which is not so mature as in the case of Central and Northern EU member states. And the impact, we will refer also to the impact that cohesion policy, European Union's cohesion policy has on the Greek research system. Let's begin with the context of modern EU research, technology, and innovation policy. European Commission recognized already in the mid-1980s the significance of technological progress on economic growth, job creation, and environmental protection, having in mind the main argument of economic theory of economic growth. It considered it to be a strategic factor for European economy's ability to enforce its competitiveness and achieve sustainable growth rates. And historically, research and technology has been regarded as a convenient area of activity for the European Union, even in the years that it was European, when we refer to European communities, given its technical and highly extrovert nature that favors international cooperation. Since the 1980s, the content of community policy has evolved within the framework of its main policy, research, technological and development tool, namely the framework programs, the so-called FPs. EU's initiatives and allocation of funds from its budget are an indication that this particular sector has been upgraded within the EU policy agenda since 2000. Research, technology and development has become a focal point in growth EU strategies. Excuse me for that. Namely, the Lisbon strategy and the strategy Europe 2020. Nevertheless, given that EU research, technology, innovation policy does not expand into a wide-ranging regulatory measures or a coordinating role, it remains actually limited to project funding. The reason for that is that distribution of power between the national level and EU level in the broader area of research, technology and innovation public policy is actually so constructed that national preferences prevail and national governments are not reluctant to give more competence to the EU level. Keeping these presentations of the short presentations as an introduction for the context of modern EU research policy, we can say that it is formed as we know it today by and large in the 1980s, and that was exactly the time that framework programs were introduced as its main funding tool. FP had a major contribution to research technological development project funding, and this was restricted to that, having nothing to do with the so-called institutional funding of research. And compared with other EU policies, it is very important to mention that research and technology has been the third most prominent funded sector since 2000, following common agricultural policy and cohesion policy, which cover approximately 75 to 80% of the funds of EU budget. In these two figures, you can see, on the one hand, the evolution of the budget of framework programs since the first framework program in 1984 until the last framework program, Horizon 2020, that was operated in the period 2014 to 2020. You can see here the very significant increase of FP's budget during all that period. On the other hand, you can see the FP funding, the allocation of funds contributed to research technological development area as its share on the EU budget. You can see that at the beginning it was about 3 to 5%, and nowadays it reached about 10% of the funds, the total funds of the EU budget. And this is very interesting because, as you can imagine, you have common agricultural policy and cohesion policy covering together about 75% of EU budget funding, and you have 10% more from research. So these three areas, these three sectors of public policy, agricultural policy, cohesion policy, and research policy, cover altogether about 85% of EU budget. Since the late 1990s, EU has continuously promoted research and technology's role in stimulated growth and competitiveness, aspiring to make Europe a more attractive place to invest and carry out research activities. Why was that? There was the need for finding new sources of growth so as to support European social and economic model in a proper way, trying to enhance also employment, growth, and regional development. As a result, the agreement for the Lisbon strategy was signed in 2000, and EU funding for research actions also increased. And we have here to mention, to highlight the fact that according to the decisions of the Barcelona European Council of 2002, there was the decision of the so-called 3% target. This means that European Union member states agreed that from 2002 until 2010, they're gonna increase spending, gross expenditure in research and technology until 2010 in order to reach finally 3% of GDP. We have to mention here the fact that at that time, early 2000, decade of 2000, EU average was about 1.5 to 2% of GDP. So this is a very significant increase from less than 2% to 3% of GDP. However, we have to keep in mind the fact that these were decisions made at the EU level. However, European Commission had no way to impose them at the national level. So even if European Commission, European Union agreed, the EU member states agreed that we as member states, we will increase gross expenditure until 2010, European Union has no other mechanism to support this decision. So this proved to be only a kind of discourse in the policy discourse, which was not turned out to be a reality. So 2010, gross expenditure on research and technology as a EU average has increased indeed, but not to 3%, but to about 2.2% of EU's GDP. Let's come now to present some main characteristics of research and technology system in Greece. Since the 1980s, state intervention in the research and technology innovation sector in Greece used not to follow and serve strategic long-term goals in issues relevant to developmental and industrial policy. A result of that was that academia was the one and almost unique actor that took advantage of the relatively public expenditure for research. That was also the first time that European communities' research activities had an impact on the research system, and the result was that Greek researchers participate successfully in various projects of framework program. Although political world had recognized the relation between research technology and economic growth, in terms of political discourse, it has not managed to create the appropriate mechanism so as to change the Greek productive pattern towards a more, let's say, knowledge-intensive direction that would combine new knowledge supply with its exploitation in real economy and national production. And this is the main story of the Greek research system in Greece and Greek research policy, actually, in the area of research, technology, innovation. Let's come now to some factual analysis. In this figure, you can see gross domestic R&D expenditure in terms of as a percentage of GDP, and also in terms of millions of euros. You can see that we have a constant increase in both terms, both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of GDP. So the intensity, the R&D intensity of the country has increased not only because of the decrease of the decrease of GDP, but also because of a real increase in R&D expenditure in millions of euros. And this is very interesting because during fiscal crisis that we have mentioned in the first presentation, you can see that despite these very tight fiscal conditions, the country managed to increase its expenditure on R&D. And this was translated in increase both in public terms and private. Let's see now R&D intensity in EU member states and in EU in general. You can see the blue lines are the EU member states, the red line presents Greece, and orange line presents EU average in the Euro area and European Union of 27 member states. You can see that Greece is lower than the middle, it's in the last positions of this range. However, because of pandemic and the decrease of GDP in the last 3 years, the severe recession conditions in Greek economy, this percentage that expresses R&D intensity has increased further, and today, 2020-2021, this percentage has reached 1.5% of GDP, which ranks Greece at the higher position. Let's present now the main funding sources of the Greek research system. The main funding sources for R&D in Greece are government sector and businesses, covering almost 85% of the expenditure. Resources from abroad, namely EU funds, come third. And there are two main groupings among EU member states. on the basis of division of research expenditure between private and public sector. In the first group, that includes Greece, state is the major funder of national research. The second group, that includes most EU member states, and this is actually the practice made in most countries internationally, private sector spends the majority of total national research expenditure. Although in most cases research funds from abroad are identified to a larger extent with foreign R&D direct investments, the source of these funds is almost exclusively EU funding in the Greek case. And when we refer here to EU funding, we mean the funding from the framework program. So the 15% of gross expenditure of R&D that comes and stems from abroad, which is a share that is made by and large in most EU member states. The main difference, interesting difference with the Greek case is the fact that this percent is divided to two different funding sources. These are the funding, the direct foreign direct investment from private companies of abroad investing, foreign private companies that invest in a country on the one hand, and on the other, this expresses funding from EU's framework program. In the Greek case, the first pillar of this funding source, foreign direct investment, is very, very low. So almost all the whole of EU, the whole of funding from abroad is attributed to EU funding, namely to framework program. And here you can see a very interesting figure that shows us gross domestic R&D expenditure by source of funding. It is very interesting to highlight here the low funding, the low participation of a business sector in the case of Greece, a very low contribution of the business sector in R&D funding. Greece is in the last positions of this ranking. And this is very clear compared to other EU member states. This is the green line. The red line shows us the contribution of government sector, which is pretty high in the Greek case. And this has directly to do with the fact that Greece is included in the first group of countries where state is the major funder of national research. And the yellow line shows us the contribution of funding from abroad. And as I already mentioned, as I already said, this funding from abroad is attributed to two different funding sources: foreign direct investment on the one hand, and EU's framework program on the other. In the Greek case, this yellow line has almost only to do with EU funding, namely funding participation in projects of framework program. And this very significant participation of Greek research teams in projects of framework program, EU framework program, is also shown in these three different figures, which shows us participation and funding in relative terms. On the one hand, taking into advantage the number of researchers, and on the other, the percentage of GDP, as a percentage of GDP. So let's examine it in more detail. Figure 6 gives a snapshot of participation in FP7, 2007-2013, and the participation of each member state in FP project per 1,000 researchers. And you can see here that Cyprus is first, the first position, and Greece is ranked third. Figure 7 shows us funding from FP7 per 1,000 researchers as well. Figure 6 shows us participation. Figure 7 shows us funding in relative terms, both figure 6 and 7 per 1,000 of researchers. Here Cyprus is again at the first position because of a very low number of researchers in Cyprus, while Greece is ranked fifth at the fifth position. And figure 8 shows us funding from FP7 as percentage of GDP. Here Greece is ranked at the first position and Cyprus comes third. And this shows very clearly the significance of EU funding for the national research systems, both in Cyprus and in Greece. The decisive role of EU policy for the Greek research system has also to do with the fact that dependence of framework program and respective resources, it is not significant for all member states, and we should have this in mind. Especially, this is the reality conditions, especially for those that invest high expenditure on research, having simultaneously important research tradition, and these are mainly EU member states of Central Europe, Central and North Europe. This means Scandinavian countries, this means Germany, France, etc., Austria, the Netherlands. On the contrary, those member states that do not spend nationally so high resources on research and technology and have not so traditional and elaborated national research systems, these are specifically the countries that depend more on EU research funding, project funding. Therefore, framework programs have been identified with funder and market for Greek researchers, which is a condition that is not met in all other EU member states. Beyond EU research policy and the impact that it has mainly in terms of funding on the Greek research system, we have also to mention the effect that cohesion policy has on the Greek research system. And when we refer to cohesion policy, we mainly mean smart specialization strategy. In all context, that this strategy meant for EU member states, not as funding mechanism, but also as an operating structure, as a framework for spending cohesion funds. Smart specialization strategy is transferred from the EU to national and subnational level as an ex-ante conditionality of cohesion policy. And when we refer to ex-ante conditionality, this means that EU member states should follow this practice, this strategy, smart specialization, in order to be able to receive EU funding from structural funds. The introduction of smart specialization was a new and very interesting element in the Greek policy-making practice, and this context may provide an opportunity for a new growth model for the country. It was very new and interesting for the Greek case because in previous years, Greece had not, in real terms, had not a national strategy for spending on R&D. And this framework, this practice, this strategy forced the country to prepare and implement this kind of national strategy. And it is very important that this gave the country the opportunity for a new growth model, because after fiscal crisis, Greek productive system is under a sort of double competitive pressure. On the one hand, competition comes from low labor cost countries that produce cheap products and services, not necessarily of low quality. And simultaneously, on the other hand, this pressure comes also from superior producers located in advanced economies with higher living standards and considerable technological and productive capacities. The first path seems to be a rather dead-end choice, because in a globalized world as it is today, there will be always a place where labor costs and other inputs will be cheaper. This is inevitable. And when choosing the second path, then the challenge is how Greece could formulate the comparative advantage that are required for this. So to build a knowledge-intensive growth paradigm that will be based on human capital, on research, on productive structure based on medium and high technology intensity. Smart specialization may be, therefore, smart specialization, risk-free, may be seen as an opportunity to upgrade RTI policy, national policy agenda, mobilizing both governmental and local actors. Because cohesion, when we refer to cohesion policy, this includes both policy makers at national and subnational level. Other initiatives, such as the appointment of a deputy minister for research in 2015, it is important to highlight here the fact that this happened for the first time after 1985 in Greece, support the thesis that this is a positive juncture for research, technology, and innovation in Greece after a long period from 1985 until the mid-2010s, that status quo was almost the same in Greek research system. One may not attribute this mobilization only to smart specialization. However, tight fiscal context and the need for developmental policy measures had definitely contributed to this policy shift. The General Secretariat for Research and Technology has initiated political action to prepare national strategy for smart specialization, trying to impose bottom-up procedures at national and regional level, involving thus regional authorities as well. Therefore, GSRT, General Secretariat for Research and Technology, which is responsible for planning and implementing research policy in Greece, has established specific innovation platforms in 8 productive areas: agriculture, health, energy, culture and tourism, ICT, transport and logistics, material and construction, and environment and sustainable growth. This policy-making practice and consultation was directly related to smart specialization rationale and the framework imposed by the way that this strategy should be planned and implemented in all EU cohesion member states. And the General Secretariat for Research and Technology intended also to coordinate the preparation of regional strategies in order to integrate regional smart specialization priorities into national ones. This context enabled, in practice, prioritization of research, technology, innovation sector. And it's very important that after a 10-year crisis of depreciation, as we have already shown in the previous presentation, Greece should have followed this direction even if smart specialization strategy did not exist. However, efforts do not meet one of the major issues of the Greek innovation system so far, which is low contribution of the business sector in RTI performance. And I have to remind you the figure that presented earlier, that showed the low position of Greece in EU member states ranking when we show data on funding of the business sector being the main funding source of research and technology in EU. On the whole, however, cohesion policy and smart specialization practice forced the Greek state and regional authorities to prepare relevant strategies, introducing a new element in policy-making process, disrupting existing inertia in the RTA sector. This inertia is directly related to the fact that from 1985 until for almost 30 years, RTI system in Greece and policy making in Greece was maintained, was actually stable and not developed at all. The final question, however, remains: is smart specialization strategy implementation impact and final result adequate to achieve a new growth model for Greece? This is the main question that still remains to be answered. Coming now to closing remarks of this second presentation for today, it is important to stress here that R&D personnel in Greece is capable of undertaking significant research along the innovation chain. And this is very important because that means that there are at least some elements of the national innovation systems in place. So it should not be built right from the beginning, from scratch. You have significant issues of excellence and significant characteristics and parameters that are of high quality in the Greek research system, so you can build on them, you can invest on them and develop them further. EU research system, research and technology policy and framework programs has been a valuable source of funding for the Greek research system through the framework programs, as I already said. And in other words, the research technology innovation sector deserves more attention in national policy agenda. And this should be clear in this juncture, in this timing. The timing is very right for that, because the next programming period, 2021-2027, is now planned. It's going to be implemented in the next year. So this should be in the mind of policymakers. However, the answer is not just to increase national funding, as the solution is not an algebraic maximization of inputs. You have to build further and support further the construction of the national research and innovation system in the country. In this context, smart specialization strategy is a valuable tool and may prove to be critical in the Greek case, offering probably a significant push towards redirection of national production, prioritizing RTI activities, as the previous growth paradigm that was followed in the previous decades, last decades, proved to be not sustainable and has led the Greek economy to the conditions of fiscal crisis of the previous decade. However, the last question that I made in this slide is smart specialization strategy implementation, impact and final result adequate to achieve a new growth model for Greece is still not to be answered. The final result and real impact of smart specialization practice is still not given and should be examined in more detail in next years as an ex post exercise to see the final, to examine and reach out to conclusions for the impact of this particular practice on Greek economy and Greek growth paradigm. And it is crucial to make it now. The time has come for this, because I've said already, the new programming period is now is the time that we plan the policy measures for the new programming period 2021-2027, that the measures that will be implemented in the following years. That was from me for today. Thank you so much for your attention.